Now that Sony has pretty much confirmed that the Spider-Man villain saga of films has come to an end, I think it's time we take a look back at two of the best worst films of 2024, Kraven and Madame Web. Listen, I gave these films straight 5s on Letterboxd, and while these films are objectively horrible, somehow and in some way, Sony was able to find people who could make movies so laughably bad that they were actually enjoyable. And I don't mean they were enjoyable from a watching standpoint. No, these films are enjoyable because of how predictable and poorly written they are. I'm not even joking. The entire point of both of these films is for the main characters to earn their comic accurate suits by the end of the film. Like, seriously, there's no other point to what is happening on screen than for these films to be a prequel to a sequel that will never be made. On a random Thursday last year, me and a close friend of mine decided that during one of our off periods, we would go get tickets to see Madame Web in theaters. Our thought process? There was no way that the 13% on Rotten Tomatoes could be accurate, right? And hey, what else is there to do on a Thursday afternoon during your senior year? Walking out of that theater, we couldn't stop laughing because of 1, how bad the movie was, and 2, how much we realized this movie was going to become a cult classic for years to come. From the classic line of, "He was in the Amazon with my mom when she was researching spiders just before she died," to Dakota Johnson not taking the role seriously in the slightest, the movie is just a straight up banger all around. There's a whole sequence near the beginning of the film where the entire point of the scene is for Cassie Webb, Dakota Johnson's character, to hold a Pepsi can in the frame and use that minute and a half literally for just product placement. The Pepsi can never gets opened, and for the entire duration of its screen time, arguably longer than any of the girls' actual spider suits, Cassie just kind of picks at the pull tab and then walks off screen after introducing us to 2 characters we will never see again and giving us a recap of what we saw maybe 5 minutes earlier. During one of the scenes in this sequence, one of the best lines in the film is dropped. Cassie looks directly at Mary Parker during her baby shower and drops this perfect line.
My mother actually died in childbirth.
Honestly, the line delivery here is perfect. From the way she points to what is assumed to be an unborn Peter Parker, to the way she casually shrugs off the line entirely, it doesn't even feel like Dakota is acting here. It just feels as if you're watching someone actively make fun of the line they're being given while not caring about the role in the slightest. It's quite literally peak cinema, and you can tell pretty much everyone in this movie was there just for the bag and nothing more. The villain of this film, Ezekiel, is probably the best analogy for what a mess this film must have been like to work on. Throughout the film, there are so many points where his lips just don't match up with what he's supposed to be saying. Like, I'm completely serious. For at least half of his dialogue, they ended up changing it in post-production, and they could only barely cover it up by making him face away from the camera when he spoke. To go along with this, you can very clearly tell when they changed his dialogue in post because the inflection and mixing are just completely off. It's in a completely different cadence, and it's very clear what was recorded in the studio versus what was recorded live on set. Another great scene in this film is when Cassie randomly decides to teach the girls CPR one morning for no other reason than for it to be used at the very end of the film. The scene is literally Cassie just being like, "Hey guys, I know I randomly woke you up at 5 in the morning after we got attacked, but I think it's time you guys learned some CPR." It's so completely out of place, and it makes no sense why Sony would even put it in here in the first place until you get to the very end of the film.
She's not breathing. Her heart's not beating.
You know what to do. Beginning compressions.
Interlock your fingers. Come back, Cassie.
The thing is, this line isn't even good or deserving of a spot in the final cut. It's corny, out of place, and it's so comical that I don't know why it was even needed in the first place. Also, sometime between the CPR scene and the final battle, Cassie basically just teleports to the Amazon and then back to New York in the span of 12 hours. Honestly, the way the film is cut, we have no clue how much time has passed between when she left for the Amazon and when she gets back to New York. She kind of just spawns into both places, and we as the audience just have to suspend disbelief and push this aside to let the rest of the movie play out. She does all of this character development in the Amazon, where she meets her mom, understands why she's getting these visions, and how she can stop Ezekiel from killing these girls. And then we just jump cut back to New York. Like, seriously, all sense of time and story cohesion are just gone, and we're supposed to move on and just finish the story. It's hilarious how the film progressively gets worse, and pretty much everything about this film is a train wreck. Like, I went into this film not expecting much, but I didn't think we were going to get this little. This movie is a hot mess, but an enjoyable one at that. If you go in with the mindset of, this movie is terrible, I think you'll genuinely enjoy it. It really is one of those movies where it's so bad and poorly done that it has a certain charm to it that makes it fun to watch. I don't know if I can quite say the same about Kraven though. Don't get me wrong, I think Kraven is just as bad as Madame Web, but I think it takes itself too seriously, whereas Madame Web does a good job of the cast realizing the movie is absolutely terrible. Kraven is missing that fun aspect, and it honestly kind of hurts to watch, because I think Aaron Taylor Johnson put a lot into the role and tried to make a genuine film out of what he was given. I saw Kraven in theaters pretty recently, and I don't think the almost $40 I spent on 2 tickets quite lived up to the experience of Madame Web. I still think this movie is great though. There are so many narrative issues, scenes that make no sense, and characters that are completely underutilized that if you wanted to see another Sony dumpster fire, this would be a good start. There's one character in particular, the foreigner, who I thought was probably the most interesting character in the entire film, but he never gets enough screen time to be developed in any way, and I really wish they went into more depth with him. He has some of the most interesting powers in the entire story, and his potential is wasted after he gets shot through the eye with a bow and arrow by Calypso, who, we learned maybe 20 minutes earlier, got archery training from some summer camp in elementary school, because that seems really relevant to the plot. I think she probably could have just shot the dude with a crossbow, and no one would have questioned how she got the ability to do that. It's these moments of over-explaining random unneeded details that these Sony movies do really well. They honestly add nothing to what's happening on screen, and it's a perfect representation of how flawed and overproduced these movies are. They're so stiff and corporate that there's never anything special to them outside of what feels like a studio production devoid of any art. The Rhino also has some of the most out-of-pocket moments that make no sense for his character. Like, this scream here is probably the most insane thing that happens in the film. In the theater, this completely brought me out of what was happening on screen, and I turned to my friend and we both just died laughing. Like, this character is supposed to have deep ties back to the Kravinoffs, and as we're watching him process his grief, he just lets this scream out of nowhere. There's so many stupid inconsistency things like this that are great and take any credibility for what this film is trying to do and throws it out the window entirely. Near the beginning of the film, when we're first introduced to Calypso, a Sony classic happens. We get the random plot device insertion scene. Calypso meets with her grandma, where we probably get the worst dialogue in the entire film. The point of this scene is literally just for plot development, so Calypso can get a tarot card and a special potion to eventually save Craven's life. The whole interaction feels like really bad NPC dialogue, where the devs were just like, hey, you kinda need this item, so let's put this dude here. The conversation lends nothing to the development of any character, except for it to explicitly spell out the next 5 minutes of what you're about to see on screen. The chameleon as well probably has one of the best lines near the end of the film.
I've always been a chameleon.
After the entire movie of hearing this character interpret other people's voices and be referenced as having chameleon-like properties, this line was so on the nose that I actually just shook my head in disbelief. It was the least subtle foreshadowing I've seen in a minute, and the way they kept using the same line of, oh my god, you're such a chameleon. Almost every time a character interacted with him in this film made the line of reveal so obvious that it's insane to think a professional writing team came up with it. Craven is really just a mess. And with it being all over the place tonally, you can never really feel if it's trying to be an actual film or if the people behind it realize that it really is just a train wreck. At least with Madame Web, it was consistent in making fun of itself, and I think that's where the charm fades for Craven. These films are trash, there's no doubt about it, but if you go into these films with that mindset, they transcend every preconceived notion you have about them. In order to experience any of these films properly, you have to just laugh at them, and only then can you understand the peak cinema of a company that wasted close to $1 billion on absolutely nothing.